Well, let us jump into the show with our first story. PlayStation Vita support may be ending in 2020. This is actually a story over on DualShockers that has an update as well, but we'll read the update at the end. So it says, following its Japanese release in December 2011, the PlayStation Vita has slowly been declining in popularity. It's become a niche platform that started strong with games in the Uncharted and Killzone franchises, and game releases, especially Western ones, have been scarce in recent years. If an update made on the Kickstarter page for a game called Project Sense, a Cyberpunk ghost story, is to be believed, it could potentially be the last PlayStation Vita release. And here's the quote. Quote, "That said, don't fret, development is going very well. We just want to deliver the best game we can in the best way possible. A few extra months assures that. For those wondering about the Vita release, as far as we are aware, everything is still good and set in stone for the release. We may be cutting it close, but we still, according to what we have access to on our dev publisher dashboard with Sony, are going to make the cutoff. We might be the last game ever released on the Vita," end quote. As Project Sense, a Cyberpunk story, is releasing in early 2020, this statement seems to suggest that Sony's support for releasing new games on the system may be ending next year. So that's the top of the story, and I'll give kind of my thoughts on all this as a whole here after we read the update. So the developers have since gone on to Twitter and posted a clarification of what they said. So here's the quote. Quote, "There appears to be a significant amount of misunderstanding and miscommunication regarding our update on Vita. This is partially our fault, as multiple people manage our social media, and we were not all on the same page. This is also the result of further distillation by some news sites, which have covered things based on misunderstandings as well. This has spread very quickly, much to our dismay. First off, as far as we know, there's no cutoff for digital releases currently, but with the Vita console production having ended and the SEI CEO... Hold on, let me click over here because the tweet goes on. Where's that thread? Oh my gosh. He tweets a ton about it, actually, which I did not realize. So let's... and the SIE CEO having explicitly stated Vita support will end in 2020. We've heard multiple things back. Many sources, our own publisher isn't worried, but wanted us to know the longer we take, the closer we may cut it to something coming up as an unexpected roadblock." So, okay. The rest of the statement is interesting. So, I do want to spend a minute just talking about the Vita, because obviously it is coming to an end. He links to this PlayStationLifestyle.net article where John Codera talks about the Vita support ending in 2020. And it's been 9 years, guys, which is wild to think about. You know, the Vita came out 9 years ago. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. I think the PlayStation Vita was well ahead of its time. PlayStation had this vision for bringing console quality games to a handheld device so that people could go and play Killzone and Uncharted and all of these different seemingly AAA experiences. And that's not ultimately what it ended up being in the end. In the end, it was a great place to play indie games. It was a great place to play JRPGs, but it didn't quite get the backing and support that Sony had originally planned for it. And we've talked at length on this in podcasts in the past, and the Vita was constantly a butt of jokes at when we were doing the Player 3 podcast, because Sony has had a habit of releasing peripherals and accessories that they stop supporting after some time, right? So, the Vita, the Move, the PlayStation Eye, there's been a lot of different things that they've started and haven't really kept up with. And the PlayStation Vita was one of those things, and it had some things right at the front that really kind of damned it out of the gate from the start, right? So, for instance, like the proprietary memory cards were a big deal, right? That you were spending over $100 for the largest memory card, and they really tried to push the 3G connectivity of the original device, and there was like a Wi-Fi only, and then there was a 3G model, and it just got kind of confusing. And those who purchased the 3G model, from what I'm remembering, the price for the 3G support, like to get a network plan, was just outrageous, right? And then they had the proprietary chargers as well that were also astronomically priced, and so they kind of doomed themselves from the start. And it's one of those things, and I've talked about this with the PlayStation VR, right? Like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you build a big install base and then put your biggest studios behind it, or do you put your biggest studios behind it in the hopes of building a big install base for these things? Like, if you don't have your Naughty Dog and all of your big studios working on stuff in support of this device, what's attracting people to buy it, right? And in the beginning, it was the Killzones, it was the Uncharted's, it was, these bigger titles, and those started to fall off. But and it makes sense, right? The Vita didn't sell quite as well as they thought it was going to sell, and so it didn't make sense for them to dedicate their best resources to making games for it. But I do think that the Vita is the reason that we have the handheld gaming scene that we have now. I think the Switch, I think we can thank the thank the Vita for the Switch's existence to an extent. And the Switch took a lot of lessons from the Vita. They made it really easy to develop for. They made it a premier place for indie games and indie developers to want to put their games. They kept everything pretty standard in terms of support, right? It takes regular micro SD cards. It takes a regular USB-C plug. Like, they kind of got to look in retrospect to the PlayStation Vita and say, here's what doomed it for failure. So if we want to make something that is like a console experience, a high-end, not high-end, but, console quality experience on the go, these are the things that we need to avoid. And I think the Vita is the reason that we can, that we have what we have today. And so, I don't know, the story is weird, right? With the little quote. And I think it makes sense with his explanation of like, no, we just heard like it's going to be, support's going to end sometime in 2020. There's obviously probably a cutoff date. I have to imagine that they are aware of a cutoff date. If they've stated plans for placing their game on the Vita, I think it is in their best interest to talk to Sony about what that timeline looks like. And I think it's in Sony's best interest to communicate those things, right? Especially with it being a Kickstarter. Because if they miss that deadline, then they're going to leave their backers disappointed. And so I think that they probably know more than they're letting on with this update. I do think that they are aware that there is a deadline that's close to when they're hoping to release, or at least hoping to submit their game for certification. And so this is kind of a non-story, I guess, at the end of the day with this update, but it's also been a slow news day, right? I've got like 4 items on my list today, but I've got my Vita box right back here, my Borderlands 2 Vita box on my shelf, my 3rd Vita that I bought. So I bought an OG PlayStation Vita, like a month after it came out. I was on a trip with a friend of mine, and I was like, man, we were going to be gone for a couple days. I was like, I really want to play MLB The Show. And so we went to a GameStop. I ended up buying the 3G model of it so that I could like download roster updates and stuff. And I played the shit out of that thing. Ended up down the road trading it in for some reason, and then ended up purchasing another one. And I got really into playing a lot of indie games on it. I also played a shitload of Minecraft on it for some reason. And then I don't remember what happened to that one, but I ended up purchasing a 3rd one. And then I got into things like Freedom Wars and started to in Persona 4 Golden, and started to get into the library of games that everybody had really talked about being why you need to own a Vita. And it's just stellar how ahead of its time it was. Also played a game called Race the Sun, like obsessively on that thing as well. Just a ton of Race the Sun. Those take me back to like my early days of being married, sitting in the living room playing Race the Sun on my Vita. Played a lot of FIFA on my Vita on my honeymoon. Chilling in the hotel, drinking on the balcony at 10 a.m. So I've got fond memories of the Vita. It's going to be sad to see it go. I no longer own a Vita. But I know it's brought a lot of people happiness. It's got a real cult following, and by the time if this is the last game, I think it's going to be a sad day for a lot of people. But the legacy of the Vita is going to live on in what we have in handheld gaming today, I think. So